once you know this story, you see it differently. These walls, these piers, these waters, they were ready. Not by chance, but because they had been built, tested, and used for generations. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live, and you are listening to the story of the little ships. You have been listening to part 1. When the little ships return here in May 2026, you are not just watching boats. You are watching history return to the harbour that helped bring them home. The boats are expected from the 15th of May. The main commemorative days run from the 22nd to the 25th. And the 338 silhouettes will stand here through to the 28th of June. Stay with Royal Harbour Live, because up next, the story continues. Operation Dynamo begins. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo begins. By the end of May 1940, the situation in France had become desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, had been forced back towards the coast. The roads were crowded. Communications were strained. Ports were falling. And the army was running out of space. Dunkirk became the last major route out. Not because it was safe. Not because it was ideal. But because it was still possible. Across the Channel, at Dover, planning had already begun. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay and his team understood that if the army was to be saved, it would have to be brought home by sea. The operation was given a code name: Operation Dynamo. It was not a perfect plan. It could not be. There was no time for perfection. It was an emergency answer to a collapsing battlefield. On the 26th of May, 1940, the order was given. The evacuation began. At first, expectations were low. Very low. There were fears that only tens of thousands might be brought home. Perhaps 20,000. Perhaps 30,000. Possibly 45,000 if everything went better than expected. Nobody knew that the final number would become 338,226 Allied servicemen. Nobody standing in Ramsgate, looking out across this water, could have known that. Nobody at Dover could have known it. Nobody waiting on the beaches at Dunkirk could have known it. At the beginning, there was only urgency and uncertainty. The first day was slow. Around 8,000 men were brought off. That may sound like a large number now. But against the scale of the army waiting on the coast, it was frighteningly small. The beaches were exposed. The harbour at Dunkirk had been damaged. The skies were dangerous. And the sea itself created a problem. Large ships could not simply come close to the beach and collect men. The water was too shallow. At low tide, the distance was even worse. Men had to wait. They had to form lines. They had to wade out. They had to climb aboard whatever could reach them. This is where the small boats became essential. Not because they could do everything. They could not. But because they could do something the larger ships could not do. They could get closer. They could move between beach and larger vessel. They could ferry men through shallow water. They could create a link. A fragile link. But a vital one. And that is where Ramsgate comes into the story again. Because Ramsgate's role was not simply to watch events unfold across the Channel. Ramsgate became part of the machinery of rescue. Nearly 2,000 officers and men were brought into Ramsgate from other ports. The harbour was prepared for the small boat work that Operation Dynamo demanded. Heavier craft operated from other ports too. Dover, Folkestone, Margate. But Ramsgate had a special part in the small boat side of the evacuation. That distinction matters. Because history is stronger when it is honest. Ramsgate did not carry the whole rescue alone. The little ships did not carry the whole rescue alone. But without places like Ramsgate, and without the small craft that could work in shallow water, the rescue would have been far more difficult. The story is not smaller because of that. It is bigger. Because it was not one harbour, or one type of ship, or one group of men. It was a layered effort. Naval ships, merchant vessels, small civilian boats, harbour workers, sailors, soldiers, airmen, and towns like Ramsgate suddenly pulled into one of the most urgent operations of the war. If you are just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. The harbour in front of you was one of the vital lifelines in the rescue from Dunkirk. Across the channel, the men waiting at Dunkirk were not waiting in comfort. They were exhausted. Many had been retreating for days. Some had little food. Some had little sleep. They were under threat from the air. They could hear explosions. They could see smoke. And they were looking towards the sea. The sea meant danger. But it also meant home. Imagine that. Behind you, the enemy advancing. Above you, aircraft. Around you, thousands of men. Ahead of you, water. And somewhere beyond that water, Britain. For many men, the journey home began with waiting. Waiting in line. Waiting for orders. Waiting for a ship. Waiting for darkness. Waiting for the next attack. The evacuation did not happen in one clean movement. It came in waves. Attempts. Failures. Adjustments. More ships. More boats. More urgency. At Dunkirk, the East Mole became one of the most important features of the entire operation. It was not designed as a passenger pier. But it became a lifeline. Large numbers of men were taken off from there. Destroyers and other vessels could load more efficiently from the mole than from the open beach. That was crucial. But the beaches still mattered. And the small boats still mattered. Because men were spread out along the shore. Because shallow water remained a barrier. Because every possible route had to be used. Operation Dynamo was not neat. It was improvised. It was pressured. It was dangerous. And it was constantly changing. The little ships became part of that changing answer. Some were pleasure craft. Some were fishing vessels. Some were motor boats. Some were lifeboats. Some had civilian owners involved. Others were taken over and crewed by naval personnel. They were different sizes. Different shapes. Different levels of seaworthiness. But together, they became part of the story. And this is where the phrase little ships becomes so powerful. Because it sounds almost gentle. Almost innocent. But what they were asked to do was anything but gentle. They crossed dangerous water. They worked under threat. They carried men who had been pushed to the edge of defeat. Some made repeated trips. Some were damaged. Some were lost. Some returned with men packed wherever they could fit. On decks. In cabins. In every available space. And when those men came back across the channel, places like Ramsgate had to receive them. Look again at the harbour. Imagine it not as it is now. Not calm. Not quiet. But busy. Urgent. Crowded. Boats arriving. Men coming ashore. People moving quickly. Orders being shouted. Volunteers helping. Food and clothing being gathered. The wounded needing care. The exhausted needing direction. This harbour became a place of arrival. A place where men who had expected capture, or worse, found themselves back on English soil. 42,000 men landed at Ramsgate during Operation Dynamo. 42,000. That number is almost too large to picture. So picture one man instead. Wet through. Cold. Hungry. still trying to understand how he had made it back. Then picture another, and another, and another, until the harbour becomes a river of returning men. Ramsgate did not just receive soldiers. It received shock, relief, fear, exhaustion, and survival. This is the human part of the story. Not just ships. Not just numbers. People. The men on the beaches were people. The crews on the boats were people. The harbour workers were people. The townspeople helping with food and clothing were people. And that is why this story still matters. If you are watching from somewhere far away, this view may look peaceful. A harbour on the Kent coast. Boats. Lights. Water. But in May 1940, this water carried one of the great rescue efforts of the Second World War. And in May 2026, when the little ships return to Ramsgate, they return not as museum pieces alone. They return as witnesses. Wood. Steel. Engines. Ropes. Decks. All carrying memory. The event this May is not simply about looking at old boats. It is about remembering what those boats represent. Improvisation. Courage. Duty. Survival. And the extraordinary use of ordinary things. Because that is one of the deepest lessons of Dunkirk. Ordinary vessels became extraordinary. Ordinary harbours became vital. Ordinary people found themselves part of history. Operation Dynamo continued. More vessels were called in. More men were brought off. The number rose day by day. What had first looked almost impossible began to change shape. The rescue was still dangerous. Still uncertain. Still incomplete. But it was growing. The first day had brought around 8,000 men. Then more came. And more. And more. With each crossing, the chances improved. With each ship loaded, families back home gained hope. With each arrival at ports like Ramsgate, the impossible became slightly less impossible. But this was not victory in the simple sense. The army had lost equipment. France was still collapsing. The war was far from over. The men had escaped, but Britain now faced a darker future. That is why Dunkirk must be understood carefully. It was not a triumph over the enemy. It was a rescue from disaster. And yet, rescue matters. Survival matters. A nation keeping its army alive matters. Without the evacuation, Britain's future in the war would have looked very different. The men brought home from Dunkirk would become part of the country's continuing defense. They were not just rescued from the past. They were returned to the future. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking at Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo has begun. The beaches are full. The small boats are needed. And Ramsgate is becoming one of the receiving harbours for the men brought back across the channel. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to rush straight to the famous image. The small boats. The heroic crossing. The miracle. But the truth is more powerful when we slow it down. Because before it became legend, it was confusion. Before it became memory, it was fear. Before it became a symbol of British resilience, it was a desperate operation with no guarantee of success. That is what makes it powerful. Not that success was certain, but that it was not. The men who crossed from Ramsgate and other ports did not know they were entering a legend. The men waiting at Dunkirk did not know they were part of a story that would still be told more than 80 years later. They were simply trying to survive the next hour. The next tide. The next crossing. The next attack. That is the truth beneath the legend. And when the little ships return here in May 2026, that truth should come with them. Not as noise. Not as spectacle only. But as remembrance. The harbour will be busy again. Music, markets, visitors, families, photographs, people walking the quayside, children seeing the boats, older people remembering stories they were told. And somewhere underneath all of it, the deeper memory remains. This was a harbour that helped. A harbour that received. A harbour that mattered. As Part 2 comes to a close, Operation Dynamo is no longer just a plan. It is moving. The ships are crossing. The boats are working. The beaches are waiting. And Ramsgate is no longer simply ready. Ramsgate is involved. In the next part of our story, we move closer to the little ships themselves. The vessels. The crews. The risks. The crossings. And the extraordinary effort that turned small boats into lasting symbols of courage. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 2 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, the little ships take center stage. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 3 of our little ship's story. The little ships take center stage. By now, Operation Dynamo was moving. The order had been given. The evacuation from Dunkirk had begun. Across the channel, men were waiting on beaches, on roads, near the harbour, and around the town. Behind them was the advancing German army. Above them was danger from the air. Ahead of them was the sea. And across that sea, on the English side, harbours like Ramsgate were becoming part of the rescue. Not as scenery. Not as background. But as working places in a national emergency. The rescue needed large ships. It needed destroyers. It needed merchant vessels. It needed naval command. It needed the East Mole at Dunkirk. But it also needed something smaller. Something that could move where deeper ships could not. Something that could come close to the beaches. Something that could act quickly in shallow water. It needed small boats. That is where the little ships entered the story. The name sounds gentle. Almost affectionate. Little ships. But there was nothing gentle about what they were being asked to do. These were not all warships. Many were ordinary vessels from ordinary lives. Pleasure cruisers. Fishing boats. Motor launches. Lifeboats. River craft. Sailing barges. Workboats. Boats built for weekends, for rivers, for fishing grounds, for local trade, for harbour work. And suddenly, they were being drawn into one of the most dangerous operations of the Second World War. Some crossed with their owners. Some were taken over and crewed by naval personnel. Some were handled by men who knew every sound their vessel made. Some were handled by men who had to learn fast. There was no single little ship story. There were hundreds of them. And that is what makes the story so powerful. It was not one heroic boat. It was many. Different shapes. Different engines. Different crews. Different risks. All pulled towards the same purpose. If you are just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking out across Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the story of the little ships, the small vessels that helped connect the beaches of Dunkirk with the larger ships waiting offshore. To understand why they mattered, picture the problem. The beaches at Dunkirk were wide and shallow. At low tide, the water pulled far away from the sand. Large ships could not simply come in and collect men like passengers at a pier. They would run aground. They would be exposed. They would be targets. So the men waited. Some stood in long lines. Some waded into the water. Some tried to reach boats under fire, and the small craft became a bridge. Not a bridge of stone. Not a bridge of steel. A moving bridge. A bridge made of hulls, engines, oars, ropes, courage, and timing. The little ships could move closer to the beach. They could take men off in smaller groups. They could ferry them out to larger vessels. And sometimes, they could carry men all the way back across the channel. That does not mean they did everything. They did not. The rescue depended heavily on larger naval and merchant vessels. The East Mole carried a huge part of the evacuation. But without the smaller boats, the shallow beaches would have been even more difficult. The little ships filled the gap. And sometimes, history turns on gaps. The gap between the beach and the ship. The gap between defeat and survival. The gap between being trapped and being brought home. That was the space the little ships entered. Imagine one of those vessels leaving the English coast. Perhaps from a harbour like this. Perhaps from another port. The crew knows the sea. But this is not an ordinary crossing. There is no pleasure in it. No holiday purpose. No calm destination. They are heading towards smoke. Towards noise. Towards a coastline under attack. The channel itself is not a small thing. Even in good weather, it demands respect. In wartime, it became something harsher. There were mines. There was aircraft attack. There was shellfire near the beaches. There was confusion. There was fatigue. There was the constant fear that a small vessel might not return. And yet they went. That is the heart of the little ship's story. Not that they were large. Not that they were powerful. But that they went. There is a kind of courage that looks grand from a distance. Flags. Uniforms. Ceremony. Music. But there is another kind of courage that looks like a small boat pointing its bow towards danger. That is what we are remembering. Across the water at Dunkirk, the men waiting to be rescued would have seen all kinds of vessels approaching. Some large. Some small. Some official-looking. Some almost unbelievable in that setting. Imagine standing on the beach. You are tired. You have been retreating. You do not know if the next attack is coming. You look out and see boats approaching. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Something moving towards you instead of away. For a man on that beach, a small boat did not look small. It looked like a chance. One trip. One place aboard. One more step towards home. The work was repetitive. Dangerous. Physically exhausting. Load men. Move out. Transfer them. Return. Load again. Move again. Return again. Some boats became overloaded. Some were damaged. Some had engines fail. Some had to be abandoned. Some were lost. But the work continued. And here is something important. The story of the little ships is not just a story of vessels. It is a story of usefulness. A boat that had been used for leisure became useful. A harbour that had been built over centuries became useful. Local knowledge became useful. Seamanship became useful. Calm judgment became useful. In a crisis, usefulness becomes heroic. If you are watching the harbour now, you may see yachts, fishing boats, workboats, and marina lights. Most days, they are part of ordinary coastal life. But the story of Dunkirk asks us to imagine ordinary coastal life being suddenly called into something extraordinary. That is why this story still grips people. Because it suggests that history is not only made by governments and generals. Sometimes history reaches into ordinary places. A harbour. A boatyard. A marina. A fishing community. A riverside mooring. And it says, you are needed. Ramsgate understood that. This harbour had already known storms. It had known military movement. It had known naval work. It had known the practical demands of the sea. So when the evacuation demanded small boats and organization, Ramsgate was not starting from nothing. It had the shape of a place that could respond. And the response mattered. 42,000 men landed here at Ramsgate during Operation Dynamo. Think of the harbour receiving them. Not one dramatic arrival, but wave after wave. Men coming ashore. Some silent. Some dazed. Some relieved. Some injured. Some barely able to take in what had happened. Behind each number was a face. Behind each face, a life. A family. A fear. A future that might have ended on a beach in France. The little ships helped bring those futures back within reach. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live in Ramsgate. You are listening to part 3 of our little ship's story. We have reached the moment where ordinary vessels become part of an extraordinary rescue. There is a phrase people often use about Dunkirk. The miracle of Dunkirk. It is understandable. The final number rescued was far beyond early expectations. But when we use the word miracle, we should be careful not to make the human effort disappear. Because men planned this. Men sailed this. Men loaded the vessels. Men repaired engines. Men signaled. Men waited. Men returned. Women and civilians helped receive, feed, clothe, and